ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from the Humanities Teaching app, Noetic, and I am joined by Dr. Jonathan Cook, and we are going to discuss Herman Melville's Billy Budd today. So, where do we begin? It's been a moment since I've looked at this text. I've been preparing so many other seminars. I'm working on Brave New World and Kierkegaard and Pride and Prejudice. I guess maybe we should. I want to say I had a chance to go through this book twice, and I loved it. This might, I would say this ranks up there with Moby Dick and Pierre, and in some ways maybe a little bit, I would rank it a little bit higher because it's so easy to digest. But what are your general thoughts on Billy Budd? Where do you view it within his authorship? Is this one of your favorites? How do you rank it personally?
Yeah, I think when I first read it, I was struck, like a lot of other readers, by the sort of ponderousness of the style. It was sort of heavy going at first because the style has such a deliberate, weighty tone to it. But then the more I've read it, the more I've kind of gotten used to that and have come to appreciate its merits and just sort of gotten into it on a deeper level. I mean, it's so odd because this book comes, written 30 years after Melville ostensibly gave up writing fiction. So he's kind of reinventing himself as a writer at this point, but he's drawing on many of the same same aesthetics and philosophical approach to fiction that he was working before, and of course he's fighting the same kind of moral battles that he was fighting throughout his earlier career as a writer, and dealing with this lingering problem of evil and the problem of Christianity at this point, which was it's kind of in decline. In the 1880s when this was written. I mean, we're in a Darwinian world, so he's sort of rethinking the relevance of some of these Christian myths that he used throughout his earlier career as a novelist.
Yeah, I hope we get a chance to touch on some of those.
Yeah.
There's a lot of rich philosophical discussion in this book, and I was saying to Dr. Cook off air before we began that I had a familiarity with some of the general contours of this text via my work on Soren Kierkegaard. Many people look at the relationship between Captain Vere and Billy Budd to being something analogous between the Abraham and Isaac story in the Bible, and which is the centerpiece of Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. So for Kierkegaard fans, I think this would be something that you want to listen to so you have a greater understanding of that text when you wax philosophically about it. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the composition of this text, how it came into being.
Yeah, so Melville was retired from his job in the New York Custom House by this point, by 1886. He'd served 20 years as an inspector on both the Hudson River and the East River, but mainly the Hudson River. And he was living at home in his apartment house on East 29th Street in Manhattan. And so he had time on his hands finally, and he hadn't published anything since Clairol in 1876, which is a enormous narrative poem about visiting the Holy Land. So he had a number of years to just read and think, and presumably write some more poetry. He was at this point a professional poet who published 2 volumes by 1876. So by the late 1880s, he had another volume of poetry ready called John Marr and Other Sailors, which includes poems largely devoted to nautical topics, and it kind of went back to his days as a sailor when he was a young man. But I think it also grew out of his visits to this sailor snug harbor on Staten Island, where his brother Tom, his younger brother, was a captain on clipper ships for a while, and he was the director at the sailor snug harbor. So Melville would go over there to visit his brother, and he would hang out with these retired sailors who were, mostly poor and had nowhere else to go. And I think his conversations with them sort of inspired him to think about his early career as a sailor, which he hadn't written about for a while. So he published this volume, John Marr and Other Sailors, and Billy Budd actually began, we know this for sure, as a head note to a poem about a sailor who's going to be hung. But he's a grown man, and he's a very different kind of personality than Billy Budd. But what Melville started doing was kind of writing out a little biographical introduction to this character that he wrote about in this poem about a sailor facing imminent execution. And as he wrote this head note, it kind of miraculously expanded into a short novel. And so for about 2 years, starting in 1888, 2 or 3 years, he kept accumulating manuscript for this story. And so he ended up with a very sort of chaotic collection of manuscripts with lots of writing, overwriting, and then things pinned to other pieces of paper. The whole thing is sitting in Houghton Library in Harvard. And so he died in September 1891 without having published this work. What happened was it ended up in a bread box for the next, let's say, 30 years until his wife, or his widow rather, Elizabeth, gave it to Melville's first official biographer to publish, saying, "Hey, here's another manuscript of Herman Melville, and it's never been published. Why don't you do it?" Raymond Weaver, the first, official biographer of Melville, who wrote the first biography in the 1920s, took it and brought it to publishers, and he tried to figure out the manuscript and published a version of it in the 1920s. Now, there's been an ongoing controversy about how to read the manuscript, and other scholars have tried to create what they think is the most likely version that Melville would have wanted. And the most reliable text we have now was published in 1962, I believe, by two scholars, Harrison Hayford and Merton Sealtz, who were well-known Melville scholars. So in fact, what we're dealing with here is what many people believe is a novel that is not quite finished, but is almost there, and just needed a little tweaking to get it to the publisher.
That's so amazing. I had no idea this was a posthumous text.
Yeah.
You could do investigations on the nature of the reconstructing of this book alone.
Oh yeah. There's been a lot of scholarly ink devoted to figuring out the best way to interpret some of these narrative sequences. Now, I personally have not examined the manuscript, although it is in the process of being put online by Hofstra University, which was originally the editorial home of the Melville Society journal called Leviathan. So very soon you should be able to leaf through the manuscript yourself and sort of do it yourself, Billy Budd.
Why do you think he didn't formalize and finish it?
Well, he was getting weaker as he was writing it. I mean, he ended up with hardening of the arteries, heart failure. So he just did not have a lot of energy, and I think there were so many hours in the day where he could spend reading and writing, and I think he just couldn't muster the energy to make the definitive version of it. I mean, what he needed was someone to go and just do a fair copy manuscript, because as is now, it's a jumble of papers and in different color pencil and ink, and
So was he working on this when he died? He just ran out of gas?
well, I think the last indication of his dating of the manuscript, I mean, it's kind of ambiguous because he sort of wrote, I think, finished on one leaf in spring of 1891, and he died, in September. So he probably thought he had the whole thing there as a narrative, and then he would go back and just polish a few portions of it.
Do we know if he did anything else in that interval between the spring and September? Or
Well, he had two other poetry manuscripts on his desk. I mean, he was quite busy at this point.
yeah,
He published a volume of poetry called Timoleon, uh, which is a lot of poems about the Mediterranean world and travel, some of which probably dated from his trip to the Mediterranean world and Middle East in 1856-57. So he probably had a bunch of poems left over, but then he probably added to them. But he got them all together to publish in a 25 copy print run,
wow,
which was what he did for John Marr and other sales. So these were tiny editions for his friends and family.
wow.
And so when he died, though, he had two other volumes of poetry in manuscript, and they've since been published. It's all very beautiful poetry. One is called Weeds and Wildings. So he had a lot of stuff sitting on his desk, and some poetry, and then of course Billy Budd. And he also had some other narrative sequences he was involved in. And I think it's an interesting question why he decided to go back to prose fiction. I think one of the best answers is that he was reading a lot of Balzac in the 1880s. I think he read about maybe about 8 or 10 volumes of Balzac of stories and fiction. And I think he got so kind of carried away with admiration for this world of Balzac that he kind of remembered that he himself was a novelist at one point, and he wanted to sort of say, I could do something like that too, because some of Billy Budd actually had some interesting resemblances to a couple of his stories of young sort of androgynous men who die tragic deaths, and a couple of people have argued for that similarity. So I think that's probably the best theory about what made him go back. But of course, there are other ideas as well. I mean, there was a lot of labor unrest in the 1880s, 1886. There was the famous Haymarket riot, and the hanging of these people that caused a lot of protest. So the idea of authority and oppression of workers that comes up in Billy Budd was directly relevant to the U.S. in the 1880s, and all these strikes and efforts to improve the lot of immigrants and working people.
Well, I find it all fascinating. I mean, there's so many other issues to get to. We should probably move to.
Yeah.
I mean, really, like I said, we could do a whole episode just on this part of the construction of it.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the thing is that it doesn't read like a fractured or unfinished text. I mean, these scholars that you mentioned earlier made it very continuous.
Yeah, they've done a very good job, and you can study. There's actually an edition of their of the manuscript that they put out, as well as the finished text that they put together, published by the University of Chicago. So you can actually look at the original manuscript that they were piecing together.
It'll be Yeah, it'll be exciting to compare the original to what they came up with.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that one of the themes that was in Melville's fiction was this sort of heroic androgynous character, but were there any other sort of thematic continuities between Billy Budd and his earlier fiction?
Yeah, well, the text that a lot of people point to is White Jacket, which he published in 1849, and it was about a sailor's experience, called White Jacket. That's his sort of pseudonym, on a ship, U.S. battleship, called the Neversink,
It's a
traveling.
good name.
Yeah, well, actually named after the Navesink Hills,
Oh,
New Jersey, but the Neversink, of course, reminds you of sort of naval legend and lore. So it's about the experience of a common sailor in this big, huge battleship, and I mean, there's no actual warfare going on, but he's sailing from the Pacific around Cape Horn up through Brazil and then up to Boston, which is what Melville did when he joined the crew of the United States a battleship in 1843 in Hawaii, and then he disembarked in Boston in October 1844. So he based the book on that experience, and it's an interesting study of a sort of complex human society that's kind of isolated on its own, so it has a sort of allegorical feel to it. And it's all about, the the relationship between the officers and the enlisted men, because the officers at the time had absolute power over the men, and there was a constant stream of corporal punishment going on in the Navy. The cat o' nine tails, was the instrument of punishment, and so for so many infractions, you would be brought up to the deck and tied, have all your wrists and legs tied, and you'd be lashed for any number of times and humiliated with the other sailors because they had to all go there and watch this happening. So the question for a lot of White Jacket is trying to figure out the proper relationship between authority and the common man on the ship, and just how something like an institutional vehicle like a battleship operates. So in Billy Budd you have the same issue of the agent of punishment, the master of arms, John Claggart, who's going around threatening, this terrible punishment to people for little infractions like having their locker look too messy or something like that. So that's why Billy Budd wants to be super obedient and not offend anyone when he's impressed onto this British warship. And then the basic plot of the novel, of course, involves the fact that he's accused of mutiny because he's been impressed onto the ship. They've had to take him from a merchant vessel to fill out the lineup of sailors needed to make this a workable military vehicle. So yeah, that's one of the main similarities, and but of course the climactic battle of good and evil shows up in so many books and so many of Melville's stories, and that is. But I'd say in Billy Budd, it's really sort of it assumes a sort of archetypal form in this confrontation of Billy and Claggart and Vere, at the end of the story. So it's like Melville took all of these longer narratives and sort of distilled them into this essential parable about, you know, how the human world is um, filled with injustice and evil, and it will never be perfect. We can never get to a place where we can say that, you know, life is good all around. Um, Everything hinges on dealing with the unpredictable and the contingent and the intrusion of you know, life-threatening things into our lives, sort of. So anyway, that's a kind of roundabout answer, but
Yeah, and I think this sets up a good segue to kind of talk. I mean, you've given some background already, but to talk maybe a little bit more about the historical setting of the novel and what role it plays, and
yeah,
and in what ways is the figure of Vere an embodiment of the ideas of Edmund Burke. So, you know, I think you and I know who Edmund Burke is, but I mean
yeah,
that's kind of a name lost on modern culture. So just
yeah.
drill, yeah, go nuts. Just
Okay.
pontificate on
Well,
that for.
the book is set in 1797 during, you know, England's war with France, the Napoleonic Wars, and the big issue at the time, of course, was the French Revolution, right? Which,
Right.
in the beginning, seemed to be for a lot of liberals in England, it was an overturning of a rotten institution of monarchy, uh, and people like you know, a lot of writers in the U.S. or in mainly, yeah, in England, I'd say, um, and the U.S. I mean, Thomas Paine went over to France from America to be part of the French Revolution. And for him, for Thomas Paine, of course, it was an assertion of the rights of man, you know, giving French people finally the liberty they deserve and getting rid of these archaic laws and punishments and governments, tyrannies that just were just outlandish at the time. I mean, when you know about them. But anyway, the revolution took a more radical turn, of course, when they uh, killed you know, Louis the 16th in 1793, and then of course there's the Terror, 94, and France was then at war with England by the mid 1790s. And of course, Edmund Burke was the main voice of a sort of thoughtful conservatism, saying that the things are going too far. I mean, he was writing in the early 1790s, so the there had not been a lot of the terrible things that happened a few years afterwards. But Burke was pretty much saying that things are happening too fast. The traditions of French culture and governance were being overturned, and this was not going to end well, you know, because they're just trying to do too many radical things too quickly, you know, embodying this idea of reason, a philosophical notion imposed on what was sort of a long tradition of history. You know, putting like a round peg in a square hole. Um, so people make the analogy of Captain Vere being a Burkean character because there are a couple of passages where he expresses the thought that the French Revolution is just not going to work because humanity likes these traditional forms that have grown up through an organic process of development, and you can't impose these sort of um, ideas that have been generated by philosophical speculation onto a long tradition of French monarchy and governance. Um, so that's why he is, he's considered to be sort of an intellectual sea captain. He doesn't mingle that often with other people. He sits in his cabin and reads a lot. So he is he's sort of a character who is opposed to what's going on, because this novel, of course, is set in a condition of war, and the ship in the book, Bellipotent, is expected any minute to engage with a French warship, you know. So the other big issue, of course, is that there have been recent mutinies amongst British sailors against the conditions that they faced, this terrible diet and these terrible conditions they had to work under. You know, this constant threat of abuse and corporal punishment and terrible food. So they actually mutinied at the Nore, which is you know, down the Thames, and so when Captain Vere is sailing his ship, there's a threat that you know, maybe the sailors will get this idea of mutiny again and rebel against their working conditions instead of fighting against the French. So there's this kind of double jeopardy going on, that the ship itself is possibly going to engage the French, and then on the other hand, these sailors are disgruntled because of recent dissatisfaction, and maybe they're going to rebel against the officers on the ship, you know. So historically, you know, Melville, I mean, this is the world that his grandparents knew, his grandfather, and you know, he'd only read about it, but I think he sort of related to it because of this big debate between, you know, this was sort of the birth of the modern era and the idea of, you know, liberal versus conservative. This was something that interested him philosophically, especially in the aftermath of the Civil War as well, because that had been a huge ordeal, of course, for the nation, with some parallels to what was going on in the 1790s. Anyway.
I think it's a pretty successful summation of that. I mean, I like this next question a lot. I think it's very, very profound, but I want to talk about the three main characters of Billy Budd and John Claggart and Edward Fairfax Vere. What about them embodying an archetype trio of characters, specifically Adam, Christ, Satan, and God the Father? Did Melville intend that? What's your take on this?
Well, yes,
that's a huge question.
Of
right?
course, he intends it. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this was the central drama of so much fiction in the 19th century. You know, the fall from innocence. You find it in Hawthorne over and over. You find it in Melville. You find it in all kinds of writers. I mean, it's part of the sort of coming of age narrative as well. But if you consider the fact that the United States in the early and mid 19th century was so invested in its Protestant belief system. I mean, if you study this era, you find that church attendance was the highest ever, or church membership rather, was the highest ever in American history. And you know, half of the things being published at the time were sermons and religious tracts. So people were really immersed in this sort of religious biblical world of mainly Protestant belief. So the story of the fall from Genesis and as it was re-embodied by John Milton in Paradise Lost, you know, a literary classic that was very well known at the time. This was like a natural narrative template for any kind of story you wanted to put together. So Melville took that template to you know, recreate this story of human innocence confronting a sort of baffling source of evil and suffering a terrible defeat in the face of it, but then, you know, humanity trying to make sense of what happened afterwards. So you know, these are literary characters. You're not seeing really transparent allegory going on here. but you're seeing, you know, hints here and there that this isn't yet another rehearsal of the story of the fall, combining elements of Genesis and Milton as well, because you know a lot of the envy that um, Claggart feels for Billy Budd as an exemplar of a sort of attractive young man, and innocent and good natured, and doesn't have any kind of ill will towards anyone. He's a very beautiful, sort of androgynous masculine figure. You know, this intense admiration of Claggart, who's the master at arms, the chief disciplinary officer, causes this kind of sickly sense of envy that, you know, somehow he has to bring him down a peg. You know, he has to do something to tarnish this guy, because it just makes Claggart look bad. You know, he himself is hinted to be a figure who joined the British Navy to avoid imprisonment. You know, he might have come from France originally as an exile, but there's something shady about Claggart, and his reaction to Billy Budd is really a classic example of, you know, someone who is envious and insecure and just hates it when other people look better than they do. You know,
Yes.
very human emotion, but it's really what surprises me is that a lot of readers don't see this as a classic sociopath. You know, everyone thinks, well, maybe he must be gay and he must be in love with Billy Budd, and he wants to, you know, have sex with him, but he can't because he's an officer. But I really think that it's just a basic psychodrama of this type of character. And if you go out there and read the literature, yeah, this is a classic sociopath who just ruins people by having no conscience. You know, who just acts on their emotions of resentment and envy, and is very cleverly devious in doing it. You know. And so they're, in normal circumstances, you might think they're crazy. I mean, they should be institutionalized, but they survive out there. You find them, you know, in business. You find them all over the place.
The heads of
You have
government.
one. You have them at the heads of government. Okay, you there?